Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second lecture of the Euro-Arab Conversations lecture series. This lecture series aims to unpack the interrelations between the EU and the Arab world, to promote a Euro-Arab dialogue, and to create a forum that strengthens understanding, appreciation, and empathy among the monastic community. And tonight's lecture will be delivered by Dr. Anne Rennick, who is a researcher at the Center of the Advanced Middle Eastern Studies at London University. Her research focuses on social movements and alternative forms of political engagements in the Arab region. Her work also explores patterns and factors influencing youth mobilization and civic and political participation, which puts forth a concept of youth as a generational political practice. She is currently on a sabbatical leave from her position as Deputy Director at the Arab Reform Initiative, which is an independent research institute that works closely with experts from the MENA region to promote a homegrown agenda for democratic change and social justice. The Arab Reform Initiative is also provides a platform for inspirational voices based on the principles of diversity, impartiality, and gender equality. The lecture, of course, will be followed by Q&A, so feel free to put your questions in the Q&A option down below. And so, yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Rennick, for giving us the time to give this lecture. I'm personally looking forward to it, and I will now leave the floor to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here this evening and to have a chance to speak with you all and present this research. So as Sharala said, I am currently a researcher at the Center for Advanced Middle Eastern Studies at Lund University, but I'm also the Deputy Director of the Arab Reform Initiative. And the lecture I'll be providing tonight is based on a publication. It's a presentation of a publication that came out at the Arab Reform Initiative last summer. So it is something that is available for those that are interested. I'm going to go ahead and do a share screen. I have a very basic PowerPoint presentation. I tend to just speak, so I don't necessarily use PowerPoint all that much, but I am going to try to use it this evening because I know sometimes people like it, especially because we've all had so much Zoom. I'm assuming everyone can see that. Yeah, all right, great. Let's see. So I think I didn't change the title. Sorry about that. It's not the correct title. That's okay. So as I said, the presentation I'm making tonight is based on an area of work that we conduct at the Arab Reform Initiative on diasporas as political actors. And our idea, because one of the things we try to work on is where are the sources of meaningful political and social change in the Arab region today. If we can agree that it doesn't happen very often top down, so what are the different forces bottom up and the different agents of change bottom up? And so one of these agents of change that we've identified are diasporas, and specifically in light of 2011, because in the post-2011 context, because of the different political processes that have occurred in the region since 2011, what we see is that there's been multiple waves of departure. And this is, of course, due to the conflicts. We have multiple countries in very severe intractable conflicts that has caused multiple waves of departure. Obviously, we're very aware of the refugee crisis in Europe in particular, but we also have other waves of departure because of the authoritarian backlash in certain countries, or even the economic crises that were happening. So we're trying to really problematize the formation of diasporas in light of 2011. And one of the things we're really interested in looking at is the concept of political remittances. So much of the literature on diasporas has, of course, focused on economic remittances and how diasporas are economic players, the role in supporting economies at home. What we're interested in is political remittances, by which I mean the transfer of political ideas, of norms, practices, and behaviors, and really looking at it in multiple directions. So it's not just diasporas and they're remitting politically towards countries of origin or home countries, but also how it goes the other way, and how what is happening in the home countries actually can influence mobilization, activism in host sites, and also across diasporic communities, right? We've got diasporas are spatially dispersed. So what is a community in one site, in another site? How are they interacting and exchanging these political ideas and behaviors and norms? So the other thing we're interested in looking at is what informs the act of this political remitting. What are the different structural factors, the different other types of factors that are influencing when someone mobilizes and under what conditions? So really what we're looking at is how all this multi-directional flow of political ideas and practices is leading to new identities and solidarities. What are the new identities and solidarities that are emerging? How can we think of citizenship in new ways that goes beyond obviously territorial configurations, that goes more towards practices and more towards expanded notions of what constitutes a citizen, especially for so many people that are in diaspora, people that have searched exile or who have been forced out. They're in a very liminal status, right? They aren't sure themselves if they're going back, if they're staying. And so how do we rethink of citizenship beyond the more traditional way of migration or of territorial configurations? And what are some of the outcomes of diaspora mobilization in terms of transitional justice, in terms of achieving accountability, in terms of achieving political and social change, and in nation and state building processes? So that is broadly what this area of work is concerned with. And on the website, there is quite a lot of different studies that you can find, different webinars we've held. So there's a lot of different aspects of the research. But what I'm going to be presenting now is, as I said, it's a study that we produced this summer. It's called Organizing in Exile, Dynamics of Mobilization Engagement of New Arab Diasporas. The website is down here, the link. And this is a study that it's a collective volume with a conceptual introduction and then 3 empirical chapters. And each chapter is looking at a specific community, but in different places, different sites. Just by way of vocabulary, very quickly, I use the terms in this presentation, home site or home country or country of origin, a bit interchangeably. I am very much aware that is, it's a heuristic device. It's not actually totally accurate. Someone who is 2nd generation or 3rd generation diaspora might identify their homeland or their home country differently than someone who is a new arrival. I'm just doing this for simplicity's sake for the purpose of this. So using the terms home site and host site. But again, I'm aware that it's much more complex than that. So we have a first chapter by Ula Kadum, which is about the Iraqi diaspora, and it's looking specifically at the Iraqi diaspora in the UK, which is a historical diaspora, but looking at how it's changed since 2011. We have a chapter by Huda Mziudet, which is on the Libyan diaspora, and it's looking and comparing the Libyan diaspora and its forms of mobilization in Tunisia versus in the global north. And then we have a chapter on the Yemeni diaspora by Maisa Shujaldin that is looking at the diaspora in the UK, which is again a historical diaspora, as well as in Cairo and in Istanbul, which is a very new location for the Yemeni diaspora. So the purpose of this and the reason why we're looking at these different sites is also to start unpacking the differences in terms of mobilization capacity based on different sites, and really looking at what's different for a diaspora that's in Europe, for example, than a diaspora that's still in the Middle East region. A note on method. So all 3 studies are based on about 25 semi-structured interviews that were undertaken with members, activist members of these different diasporas in question. So people who consider themselves activists and who are mobilizing, as well as a review of different organizations that have been set up specifically for these diasporic communities, whether they're for cultural engagement, whether they're for political mobilization, just for welcoming new arrivals, but specifically diaspora-centered organizations that have been set up. All right, so the points of departure of this study. As I mentioned, one of the things we're really interested in studying is what has changed since 2011, and why is 2011 a critical juncture in diaspora formation and in the forms of mobilization of these diasporic communities. And so, one of the things that we're concerned with and what we're seeing is that although there are these historical diasporas in all 3 countries, there have been diasporas from before, what we're seeing is that there's a huge increase in the size of these diasporas. Many more people are in diaspora, are going to these different communities, either existing ones or setting up in new sites. And so we're really seeing a diversification in these diasporas. We really wanted to explore that. And we're also seeing new forms of political remittances that are emerging. So we wanted to dive deeper into that. And the idea is to really investigate this nexus between conflict dynamics, different types of conflict dynamics in the post-2011, and the patterns of diaspora formation and the what is informing political mobilization. So given that the emphasis is really on this nexus, how these conflict dynamics are influencing this diasporic mobilization, diaspora formation and mobilization, thought I would very briefly just review the different conflicts in these three countries. And again, very briefly, because that's not the purpose of this this presentation, but I do think it's useful. So in all three countries, we have very complex conflict dynamics that have been unfolding over the last decade. And it's really important to keep in mind that it's not just one conflict. It's actually multiple and overlapping conflicts that we see. So there's not one Yemeni conflict, there are multiple Yemeni conflicts. It's not one Libyan conflict, it's multiple. And they include both social conflicts as well as political conflicts. So in the case of Libya, for example, we have in 2011 a social conflict that starts with the uprising, right? Libya is one of the classic examples of what we call then the Arab Spring, the national uprising demanding, dignity, social justice, but really a rethinking, a shaking up of the political order, right? A radical transformation to the political order, to the systems of redistribution that were in place. And so we have this initial conflict that arises, this social conflict that arises, that quickly becomes more of a militarized conflict. And in Libya, it looks initially like there might be some sort of negotiated transition process. There is an interim government that comes into power. It seems like it has a certain remit. It seems like it's going to allow for that transition to take place. But by 2014, the process gets derailed. And what we see is that there are two rival governments that emerge, one representing the East and one representing the West. And this is where we have that East-West divide that emerges so strongly and that marks so strongly the civil conflict, the civil war in Libya. We also have a process of an explosion in the militias. We have 1,500 militias in Libya, each with varying degrees of local legitimacy and local authority. And we have these rival governments, none of which can establish its authority over the entire Libyan territory. Then if we look at the Yemeni situation, we have this conflict similarly to Yemen, to Libya, where we have in 2011 the Arab Spring, the national uprising. And it looks very much like the Arab Spring in the other countries, in Egypt and Tunisia. It's very much youth-led. Youth are really the avant-garde of that revolutionary moment. We have kind of different political players, different political groups that kind of get united around this banner, the occupation of physical spaces, of symbolic spaces in the capital. It looks very much like in other countries. And similarly to Libya, it looks initially like a negotiated political settlement can occur. Some sort of transition. There is, under the UN auspices, mediation, there is a national dialogue conference that gets established. The sitting president gets removed under a negotiated deal, a new president arrives. We bring together different factions, different actors in civil society with the idea that they can together negotiate the future of Yemen, what the future formation of the state should be. This also gets derailed quite quickly, and the country descends into civil war, which then becomes a regional conflict as we have the Saudi and UAE who intervene in the conflict. It becomes a proxy war with Iran. In the case of Iraq, we do have a national uprising. It does not occur in 2011. It actually occurs in 2019, which is part of what the countries that were sort of being billed as the second wave of the Arab Spring. There's a series of countries that have these second national uprisings using a lot of the same slogans and the same idea of kind of radically rethinking the power structures in the country, the bases of the political order and the redistribution system. But this uprising is largely based in the south of the country, as well as in Baghdad. In the north of Iraq, we have a very different conflict, which is the conflict with ISIS. As you know, ISIS comes in into that 2014, takes over huge swaths of territory in the north, and is able to impose its order without too much of a problem, without too much of a fight initially by the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army does eventually come back in 2017 and is able to defeat, which I put in quotations because ISIS is not totally defeated, but defeat and reestablish its authority over the north. So all this to say, what we see in all these countries is that the conflicts, we've led to a real fragmentation of the security sectors, a total fragmentation of the security sectors, as well as the political orders. We have multiple different political orders in different parts of the country. We also have, a lot of different degrees of legitimacy of the different militias that are in place, and a destruction of the social fabric. And when we have interviews with people in these countries, this is something that is cited over and over again. Of course, the social fabric has been destroyed. So we have really a breaking up of the institutions of state, but also the notions of the nation in a lot of ways, and of the social contracts that were put into place. So this is kind of the context in which we are examining the formation of diasporas as well as the mobilization. It's in this complexity that we're trying to examine diaspora formation and mobilization. So just briefly, what do I mean by diaspora? There's a huge literature out there about diaspora. What is the meaning? What is the definition of diaspora? The working definition I'm using here is that of Baubeck and Feist, which is a dispersed, extraterritorial, and imagined community that shares a basic political identity attached to the homeland, in quotations, and that carries out some form of mobilization or material or immaterial engagement for the specific purpose of supporting or challenging domestic politics or the state of origin. So I think there's a couple of things that are really critical to the way we're conceptualizing diaspora for the purpose of this study. Obviously, diaspora is not an ethnic identity, right? It's rather a social process. We talk about diasporization, the processes by which one comes to identify themselves as being a member of a diaspora, but also the performative nature, right? Critical to this definition is the idea of some form of mobilization or collective engagement or action for the purpose of maintaining that sense of homeland, of collective homeland. And also the political dimension here, right? It's supporting or challenging politics in one way or another, which to us is very critical because we're looking at this question of political remittances. So other characteristics that I think are important to point out is we're not looking at, just as we're not looking at one conflict, we're not looking at one diaspora. There is no one Yemeni diaspora or one Iraqi diaspora. It's actually multiple diasporas with multiple different identities and forms of engagement. And this depends on a lot of different factors. It depends on the generation in diaspora. It depends on the wave of departure, the political dynamics that are at play, and positionality, one's social identity vis-a-vis the conflict. There's also a lot of complexity and a lot of fluidity. So I think this is an important dimension as well, is that it is not linear, right? Someone's sense of belonging doesn't stay the same. Someone's engagement doesn't stay the same, and it waxes and wanes at different points. And this is part of what we're trying to unpack is, why does someone mobilize when they do, and why do they stop mobilizing when they do? What are the different factors that can explain this and can explain that identification or non-identification with this idea of an imagined shared homeland? All right, so the first part of the studies is looking at sort of more the sociological perspective, which is the formation of diasporas, and really who is in these diasporas and what does this reveal about this diversification. So one of the first things we notice in looking at the 3 case studies is that there's a real diversification in terms of political leanings and the profiles of those in diaspora, right? So one of the first things we see is that the different waves of departure you can tell who leaves when based on conflict dynamics, and they have specific political leanings. So if we look at the case of Libya, and this is shown in the study, those that were leaving in 2011 were largely the Gaddafi loyalists, which of course makes sense because there was a reversal of the power order in 2011 as Gaddafi is ousted from power, with a somewhat violent backlash against him, of course. And so those who are Gaddafi loyalists were leaving for fear for their own personal security. Then in 2014, as the country descends into civil war, the wave of departure is largely marked by those who were more on the pro-revolutionary side, right? Those who were supporting the revolutionary movement, who were supporting the transition process. They're the ones who become marginalized in this new political order, this new political context. So the wave of departure can help explain the political profiles of those who are going into diaspora. But another thing we see is that there's a diversification in the political leanings that actually reflects the complexity we're seeing in the home countries, the countries of origin, right? So one thing we see is that if we take the case of Yemen, for example, prior to 2011, when we investigate the Yemeni diaspora in the UK, for example, it was largely divided in the North-South divide, the historical North-South divide of Yemen, and the political leanings in that division. With 2011, what happens is we have a multiplication of political ideologies and positions in Yemen. We have, for example, not only the Southern separatist movement, the Northern movements, but we also have, for example, the Islah movement, the Muslim Brotherhood movement. We've got different political positions. And what we see is that these get represented in the diaspora as well. So there are new political positions. And this is both amongst the departees who are carrying with them, maybe the positions that they were supporting when they were still in Yemen, but also amongst those who have already been in diaspora. And that's one of the really interesting things, is that even people who have long since been in diaspora, who perhaps never have lived in the country of their parents' origin or their grandparents' origin, they are also having this diversification in their political positions. So in the case of Iraq, for example, with the 2019 movement, which was very much calling for ending the ethno-sectarian logic of the state. This is a new discourse emerging in Iraq, and it's being taken up by people in diaspora, including youth in diaspora who have never lived in Iraq. So there you're seeing this diversification in these political leanings and political positions amongst the diasporic communities. But we're also seeing a diversification in terms of the profiles. And this is also because of the conflict dynamics. So one thing is when we have a lot of political elites that are leaving because there's these reversal of power structures, political elites have with them, they have as resources with them, things like access points, right? They've got access points to different power structures, both nationally and internationally. But we also have, with these waves of departure of activists, we have activists that are leaving, these pro-revolutionary activists that have left. And this goes not just for the three countries here. We see the same thing with Egyptians and a lot of the Egyptian diaspora, which is very heavily present in Berlin, for example. It's heavily dominated by activists. The Syrian diaspora as well. We have a lot of activists. We have a lot of human rights defenders, human rights lawyers. We have a lot of journalists, independent journalists, and they have a different political skill set, right? There's a knowledge of how to carry out mobilization. There's a knowledge of how to set up a social movement. There's a knowledge of cause lawyering as a tool. There's a knowledge of international criminal justice frameworks. This allows for different forms of mobilization to occur. Obviously, these people have resources that they're taking with them into diaspora that are new to these diasporic communities, and that in some cases, and that allow them to have different capacities or possibilities for mobilization and different access points. And the other thing is we see this diversity in geographic locations. So one thing we see for sure is that the historical locations where there were already existing diaspora communities, they definitely grow in size. So, London for sure, which has always been a major draw for diaspora communities, continues to grow. But we also see new sites emerging, right? Berlin has become a very important site for multiple diasporas emanating from the Arab region. We see other examples, for example, in the Yemeni case, Istanbul becomes a place that was not a historical place. So the reasons why some people choose one place or another, they're complex. There's different aspects at play. Of course, part of it is facility. If there's already an existing community, it becomes easier to go. Certain countries, because there's already these existing communities, have made it easier. So in the research, it shows, for example, Cairo for Yemenis or Tunis for Libyans. These are places where they don't need a visa, have not historically needed a visa, and where circular migration is possible. So for people who are perhaps just leaving temporarily, maybe trying to wait out, see how the conflict emerges, they don't need to seek asylum. They don't need to completely give up on their country of origin, right? So those become draws. And what we see is that in the countries where there was already an existing diaspora, there's this diversification, right? There's a real diversification that occurs as the size increases. But in the places that are sort of new, we see much less diversification, and it's much more of a homogenous community. So in the case of the Yemenis in Istanbul, it's largely those that are the pro-Islah, this pro-Muslim Brotherhood movement, right? The party. So you see sort of the homogenization of some of the smaller sites as well. All right, so some of the early conclusions we're drawing from this. One of them is that what we see is that conflict dynamics are following people into diaspora or being expressed in diaspora. And I don't mean that there are conflicts in the sense of violent conflicts occurring amongst diaspora communities, but there is a deep feeling of distrust that is visible in these diasporic communities. And this really decreases the possibility for casual mixing and social gathering. And that's important because it has a negative effect on mobilization capacity. People are not necessarily aware, or they are wary because they know someone maybe represents a different political position, a different political ideology. And this, because of the conflict dynamics are so violent in their country of origin, there is a wariness that it gets expressed in these diaspora communities. And we see these tensions and this mistrust. But the other thing we see is because of this diversity, and because there's, the spatial dispersion, the political leanings, that we actually have to carry out more micro level investigations. If we want to understand why the Yemeni diaspora is mobilizing in a certain way, we need to be thinking, well, which Yemeni diaspora, in which location, which social identity, at which point in time? We need to take all those elements into consideration in order to start to investigate and understand this idea of a diaspora as a political actor. All right, and this brings me to the second part, which is then, what types of political mobilization remnants are occurring and what informs these. This is a picture, this is from the chapter on Libya, and it is a picture of people voting, Libyans voting, I believe from the UAE. There was a move to get Libyans in diaspora voting. So that's a form of political activity, right? Voting from abroad is a form of political activity, and not all members of diaspora communities are allowed to vote. It depends. In Libya, there was definitely this effort. And again, in this past election, which has not occurred yet, but there was an effort to get the diaspora to vote. All right, so what we're seeing is that there are both traditional forms of diaspora engagement and mobilization, but as well as new ones. I have just a small chart here, which is sort of a traditional way. This is from an article by Bahar Bajer on diaspora mobilization and peace and conflict. And this is sort of traditional ways in which diasporas interact with conflict and peace, conflict dynamics and peace building processes. And this can include things like lobbying of foreign governments, of host country governments for the application of sanctions or putting pressure, participating in peace building processes, or acting as spoilers. A lot of efforts in terms of reconstruction and development, making investments, as well as some efforts at transitional justice. And we're seeing that a lot of these are still taking place amongst the three diasporas under investigation here. So we definitely see that there's an effort at lobbying of host country governments. For sure, we're seeing this, try to put pressure on certain groups. And we definitely see an effort at humanitarian aid. This is, in the case of Syria, which is not one of the countries under investigation here, but there's been some excellent work actually out of Massachusetts University on this, and on the very vibrant Syrian diasporic civil society, and the massive efforts made to provide humanitarian relief, open humanitarian corridors, funnel resources into ailing communities in Syria. So this is something more traditional, but we're absolutely seeing that in these cases as well. But we're also seeing some really interesting new forms of engagement emerging. And this can include things like changing and challenging narratives. There's a real effort to not allow certain narratives, especially hegemonic narratives, to gather all the attention and to kind of rewrite the story, especially with things like what happened in 2011, right? And who gets to have that narrative, who gets to tell that story. And so really challenging that and making sure that there's not a hegemonic narrative about this. There's also a lot of efforts, really interesting efforts in terms of memory preservation, documentation, and archiving, especially of crimes that are being committed, right? So using the resources of smartphones, for example, and translocal activist networks, where an activist who is in the country of origin can document things and then send it to those who are in diaspora, and specifically those in the European diaspora, where it can then be utilized to build cases, right? It can be archived and stored in a way to eventually have some form of transitional justice. It's really these efforts to achieve accountability. And we also see some interesting forms of cultural engagement that are taking place. There's a really interesting example in the chapter on Libya of a podcast, a diasporic podcast that different members of the Libyan diaspora listen to, especially those who feel a little bit atomized, a little bit isolated, and they can all sort of gather on this podcast. And one of the things the podcast has done is led to an Amazigh revival movement. And that's enlarging the notion of the nation. And how do we rethink of the Libyan nation to better include different groups, right? And there's also some interesting about, in the Iraqi case, about engagement activities around cultural heritage. Because of the extreme polarization that has occurred in a lot of these diasporic communities, this idea of the conflicts that follow people into diaspora, cultural engagement, and specifically something like preservation of heritage in the wake of ISIS or during the period of ISIS when there might have been a lot of destruction, that was a way to kind of gather people to mobilize for the purpose of protecting the heritage and this idea of, the nation in sort of a historical sense. So, when do people mobilize? What are the factors mediating this? So what we see, one of the interesting things we see is that the activist trajectory is not linear. So someone who was an activist, maybe in 2011, a pro-revolutionary activist, maybe even really a leader, maybe had their own group that they were working with, they aren't necessarily going to be an activist when they go into diaspora. There's not a linear one-to-one correspondence between the two, right? Some people, for various reasons, decide to stop their activism. This can do for very personal reasons, feelings of guilt, depression, feeling of our movement failed and I don't want to do it again, feeling lost. There's lots of different reasons. But what we also see is that some people who maybe were never mobilized suddenly do become mobilized when they go into diaspora. So that's an important aspect, I think, is that it's not that you have your activism in you all the time and you're always expressing it. That's simply not the case. So what we see what are the factors that are informing this? One of them is the relationship to the homeland, which gets complicated as well by migration generation, but also the political opportunity structure and social identity vis-a-vis conflict dynamics. And these interact in complicated ways. So just going briefly through these. So one of the really important things we see is that the relationship to the homeland, and that can include the existing relationship, but as well as the anticipated future relationship or even the desired relationship, can really inform who's going to mobilize in what ways and when. So for those who are sort of in this liminal status or in circular migration, are not sure if they want to stay permanently in a host site, that can actually act as a way to decrease mobilization. The idea being, we don't know how these conflicts are going to end. We don't know who's going to end up on top and who's going to end up on the bottom. And we do not want to create future problems for ourselves, right? By gathering too much attention to yourself as an activist with a preferred political position, that might hinder your ability to go back in the future. So there's that anticipated future relationship can actually prevent people from mobilizing in certain cases. There's also, in other cases though, where that anticipated future relationship can actually galvanize people when they see an opportunity to become enfranchised themselves politically. So the research, the chapter on Iraq shows this, right? In 2003, when the American invasion took place and reversed the political order, the longstanding political order, there was a lot of mobilization on the part of the Iraqi diaspora in the UK because there was this possibility to be enfranchised politically. So that future relationship can do both, right? It can act as a hindrance to mobilization, but actually also serve to mobilize people depending on how they see their own position in the future political order. But we also see that this degree of identification in mobilization is very complicated with relation to the generation in diaspora. And by which I mean, there's the first generation, there's also second, third generation diaspora. And one of the things that the research here is showing, and this has been confirmed or it's been shown in other research as well, research on Egypt, for example, is that for those who are in the second generation or third generation, who perhaps have never lived in the parents' or grandparents' country of origin, maybe have only gone back a few times, maybe didn't really identify with that, didn't see themselves as a member of a diaspora per se, when there was the uprisings in 2011 or 2019 in the case of Iraq, for a lot of people in the second and third generation, that was actually a moment when they did start to identify with this country of origin, because there was this moment sort of hope, frankly, things could change. There was a possibility for change. And it allowed people to feel that identification that maybe they didn't feel previously. And there was new forms of mobilization occurring, going on the streets, perhaps in the city of their birth, but in support of the movement that was happening in their parents' country of origin. Right. So that's a new form of diaspora mobilization. But what we see is when those uprisings, when those revolutionary moments closed, that it had the opposite effect. And a lot of people felt, the study on Yemen shows this, that Yemen is a lost case. It's a lost case. I'm not Yemeni, I'm just British, right? And so you see that as well, that dynamic. As those moments of hope and opportunity close, so does that feeling of identification and that willingness or desire to mobilize. And you see this much more in the second and third generation dynamics. The other thing that's really important that comes across is what is called, not just us that comes up with the term, the triadic political opportunity structure. So for those who study social movement theory, who do social movement studies, we talk a lot about political opportunity structure, which is the structure of opportunities and constraints, a lot of different opportunities and constraints with regards to the political context that can either enable or hinder activism. And in the case of diasporic activism, what we see is that there's three layers, right? There's the political opportunity structure in the host country. And this can include things like the extent to which someone is viewed as a victim, for example, or as an aggressor. And that can very much change the way that person is viewed and their own margins of maneuver, but also the civic space. And this is where we see such important differences in the diaspora communities in Europe and the diaspora communities in places like Egypt, for example, where there's very little civic space that's available. And so the degree to which the civic space is open, the degree to which mobilization is allowed, depends a lot on that political opportunity structure in the host countries, which is also influenced by the way that diaspora community is viewed. In the homeland, the country of origin, what we see is that in terms of political opportunity structure, one of the really important dimensions is transnational repression. Transnational repression is a very real phenomenon, is very much practiced, and this can very much hinder someone's capacity or willingness to mobilize. And when transnational repression diminishes, or the capacity for it to be carried out diminishes, that can actually galvanize people to mobilize again. So that's a really important dimension that acts and that informs mobilization. But so does the extent to which the home country is actually trying to mobilize the diaspora. There are many cases where there is an effort to mobilize the diaspora. In the research cited here, in the Yemeni case, for example, the Southern Transition Council, the Southern Separatist movement, actually tries to utilize its diaspora in the UK to support that Southern separatist movement. So there is an effort to sort of work with the diaspora and to mobilize the diaspora in support of those movements. So it can work both ways, right? It can either hinder or it can actually provide resources for mobilization of the diaspora. But the other thing that's really interesting that really comes across is the geopolitical relationship between the host site and the home country. And that has an important impact as well. And that, of course, shifts over time, right? And that shifts in relation to conflict dynamics as well. But one example that's cited in the research is with the Libyan case. So Tunisia tries to maintain a policy of neutrality vis-a-vis Libya. And this is for different reasons, historical reasons. Tunisia is a small country next to a very big country of Libya. It's a very porous border, historical ties. So given this, whereas the civil society and the civic space in Tunisia has been relatively open over the last decade, not quite the same right now, unfortunately, but has been relatively open over the past decade, where the line has been drawn is on political mobilization of the Libyan diaspora. So Libyans are allowed to live in Tunisia without needing a visa. They have their own schools, they have their own neighborhoods, they have the circular migration, but the line is drawn at political mobilization. And this is because of this desire to maintain that geopolitical relationship. The exception is when it is on the margins or in parallel to what the Tunisian state is doing. So because Tunisia has taken a role in the mediation process of the Libyan conflict, the UN mediation team was based in Tunisia at different points, conferences being held in Tunisia. When mobilization was occurring kind of in support of that peace process, that was allowed. That kind of political mobilization was allowed, but other kinds were not. And Tunisia has been very strict about this. So that geopolitical relationship and how it shifts over time based on conflict dynamics also opens and closes opportunities. And a great example of that would also be with ISIS, right? ISIS kind of shifted a lot of the possibility to put pressure on host countries to do something, right? Maybe they weren't willing to do something in Syria, but with ISIS, that changes the game, right? Suddenly there is more of a desire to intervene, for example. So that opens mobilization space. And finally, the last thing that the research is showing is your positionality, your social identity vis-a-vis conflict dynamics. And so how you are viewed, both how you view your homeland and your level of identification with your homeland, but also how you are viewed in your host site. So in the case of Iraq, for example, with ISIS, this provides a really good example of how someone's positionality changes over time, right? Someone who is a young Sunni male prior to ISIS might have been viewed in one way, and after ISIS might be viewed in a very different way, right? Might be viewed or might perceive himself to be viewed as an aggressor. Whether or not people really do is maybe a different story, but there might be that perception that I'm viewed as an aggressor because I'm a Sunni male that comes from northern Iraq, right? And that can close opportunities, but can also close the feeling of belonging. So it does both things. It can reduce that sense of identification, but also the margins of maneuver for personal activism because the positionality changes vis-a-vis conflict dynamics. So just very briefly, I'm not quite sure how much time I've been talking. Oh, I really need to get going. All right, so very briefly on the question of impact. What has been the impact of all of this? All these new forms, we've got these new forms of mobilization, we've got a lot of effort. To what extent are these diasporas acting as political actors, as effective political actors? And of course, that gets to a question of what do we mean by success? How do we define success? If we're saying we've seen massive political change, that's not been the case, obviously, but we have seen certain things. And a lot of that depends on the political status, the size of the diasporic community, and its degree of integration into national, international networks, but also the kinds of political and legal contexts that it's operating in and the allies. So if we look at what impact has been observed, I should first start by saying sort of universally across the interviews, what we're seeing is that people are willing to mobilize and try to act as a political actor and make a change if they can ensure that it's not going to exacerbate the conflict. There's this sort of subtle do no harm principle. So no one wants to do something if it's going to run the risk of making things worse. And that actually does prevent people from mobilizing because they just don't know, is this going to make things worse if I do this? But what we have seen is that there's definitely been a filling of information gaps. Activists, those in diaspora are able to, they have knowledge of things that are going on the ground that other people don't have. Right. And social media, WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, all of this has been very useful in allowing that knowledge to be accessed elsewhere. As an example, the Iraqi, there's a lot of information about the atrocities that were committed by ISIS, but there are atrocities being committed by other players as well, including the Iraqi government, who has targeted assassinations of youth activists. That knowledge is being disseminated by those in diaspora very much, because it's not very much in the media right now. It's hard to find that kind of information. So diaspora activists are really filling those information gaps. We also, though, see definite progress in terms of, or advances in terms of transitional justice. And I think everyone knows of the case of the use of universal jurisdiction by Syrian activists and their allies to try jailers for crimes against humanity in the Syrian conflict. And that is very much as a very good example of how being in diaspora and having access to different legal frameworks and different strategies for mobilization has allowed for that kind of impact to occur. And they allowed for this idea that we can actually start pursuing transitional justice both before the war is over and even in the absence of a transition. And there's also this expanded notion of the nation, right? That there, because of these discussions about what constitutes Libyanness, what is the position of ethnic minorities in Iraq post-ISIS? These discussions that are occurring very vividly in diaspora by all these communities that have had to flee or that are fleeing is allowing for an expanded notion, a rethinking of the bases of the nation. And the same with the state. There are different efforts on the part of diasporic communities to mobilize and participate in peace-building processes and in state-building processes. And the case of the Libyan diaspora with the peace building process, there's been members of the Libyan diaspora who have been involved in that and are participating in that. And that raises issues for them about their own legitimacy in the process. But there is that effort to include them and have them be thinking. And that's where, again, we can see those political remittances. Someone who is in diaspora has a different perspective. And that's allowing for that, those different ideas to flow in different ways within the processes of conflict resolution, of state building. I'm going to go ahead and stop here because I talked much longer than I had anticipated. So I'm going to stop sharing. So thank you, Shaka. You should have cut me off earlier.
No, it was really interesting, honestly. I'm really glad with the information that I just received. I hope the attendees also agree. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to share them through the Q&A. I myself do have a question, like a really, it might be a silly question, but when can we talk about an organized diaspora? What does it academically mean to say that this is an organized diaspora?
I don't know if I could give you an academic definition, but I mean, there's so I'm a social movement scholar, so that's really where I come from. So we talk about we can talk about organizations, right, which have different degrees of formality, can be quite informal, but there's some form of a network or some sort of existing form of organizational framework, whether it's formal or informal. I would say that that could be a definition of it, that has some degree of resources, some degree of internal a sense of the collective that holds itself together. That could be an idea of an organized diaspora. But that being said, a lot of what we see is that diasporas, it's a lot of individual activists in certain cases, and we've seen that in the Syrian case, right? A lot of individuals who are doing something, but they tend then to find each other and to coalesce. And so I think that would show the definition of some form of being an organized diaspora, is when you start to coalesce. Then there's definite, like, very clear organizations that exist. And in the chapter on Yemen, for example, there's an example of the Yemeni Student Union that got formed, or several actually, in Istanbul. So that's a very clear example of being organized, right? We're going to form our own student union, and we have specific activities that are for the Yemeni diasporic community. So I think there's different ways, and there's a lot of organic ways as well in which a diaspora can be organized around social gatherings, which is really important actually for that informal exchange.
Very interesting. And so because the part where you talked about heterogeneity and homogeneity, like for example, the Yemen diaspora in Istanbul are a very small community because it's just a new destination that is being formed or emerged now. And does the number of the diaspora that is in a host country affect the activism level of the diaspora? Because, for example, if it's a really huge diaspora, then there must be a level of polarization. And like you said, the first wave of diaspora from Libya were different than the second wave. So does that affect, or do you not consider it from that point of view? Is it just, do you think of it separately?
I think it can affect. I think it depends. I think that certainly when you've got more people, right, you can have more of a resource. Those are resources, right? Those are mobilization resources. So you can have different types of activities, different types of visibility that can display themselves. In very, very small communities, I think you maybe would have less. There's a study that that the Arab Reform Initiative will be publishing this week it's from a project out of the University of Copenhagen called the Mediatized Arab Diasporas, and it's looking at the interaction between media consumption and use, and diaspora formation and mobilization. And one thing it's showing in the case of the Bahraini diaspora is that it's a very small community in Denmark, and as a result, its forms of mobilization are different. So it definitely can have an impact on what can be done, but it also depends on who's there. So I think all this to say, I think it requires more of a micro level investigation to see to what extent size is a critical factor or not. Yeah, I think if you're going to host a big, protest movement, yes, you need size.
True.
Or you need allies, right? You're not going to do that if your community is 25 people, or it's not going to be very significant. Yeah.
We have 2 questions.
Yes.
Okay, so from Fitnat is asking if the research is going to be openly available.
It is. It's available on the Arab Reform Initiative website. So it's called Organizing in Exile. So the whole thing is publicly available. And there are also a series of webinars as well with some of the authors, in fact. So that's an opportunity to hear from the authors as well. What role did social media play? How is it role different to traditional media? Yeah, I don't think we went too much into that, but the study I was just mentioning that's coming out this week does go a little bit more into that. So if you're interested in the media and different forms of media, including, sort of constricted media from the region, which might be less open versus media that's, much more open, citizen journalism, et cetera. That's collection of studies, which is coming out this week, does have some more on that. I don't think these studies look that much into it. Although there is, the case in the Libyan one, I mean, that is a form of new media, right? The podcast series. And she talks very much about that. And it figures highly in the study because it's seen as this this real gathering point for the diaspora, and a really important one in terms of maintaining that process of diasporization, maintaining that attachment, that feeling of belonging to this imagined community, and also enlarging who gets to be part of that imagined community and what are the different elements in that imagined community. So I think in that sense, we're seeing that new media, social media does play a really important role, especially because of this spatial dispersion and allowing for different people to gather in a way that would be impossible otherwise.
Okay.
No, see, yeah, sorry, I just see a little more.
Does
the research include how identity is affected to open source? No, it does to broader identity issues here, but I do think it's really important, and especially if we consider, this part of the Euro-Arab conversation series, and I think, we have huge diasporic communities from the Arab region in Europe today, right? There's 1 million Syrians in just Germany. And I think how these communities are identifying, how individuals are identifying themselves, it's not linear, it's complex, and it's changing all the time. But I think it's a really important field of investigation. And I think one thing I haven't done enough research on this myself. This is just based on more anecdotal conversations and observations. But I think for a lot of people, what is emerging is the identity is not tied to the citizenship of the host site, but maybe to the city. And there's a city-based identity that's emerging. So, and this is partially because of this liminal status, right? If someone doesn't know how long they're staying, maybe just fled and thought, I'm not going to stay in Norway, and suddenly it's been 6 years and you're still in Norway, you start to identify yourself as a Norwegian or a resident of Oslo instead. And I think that kind of, I think that breaking out of the transnational lens and actually thinking about it as city-based or site-based, we might actually be able to open up some really interesting investigations into identity. And there's some really interesting articles written about the Berlin-based diaspora, of multiple different communities, Egyptian, Sudanese, Syrian, and the conversations they're having about that, about what does it mean to be in Berlin? Not what does it mean to be in Germany, but what does it mean to be in Berlin? And so I think taking that lens of the site-based, the city-based, and not the nation-based or the broader territorial configuration of the state opens up a lot of really interesting identity-based questions and avenues for research. Let's see. Hybrid form of identity. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, how someone identifies themselves, again, it's very fluid, it changes over time. And I think you're right. I think people are not going to just say that I'm this or I'm that. And even that activist identity, I think, is something that people are grappling with in a lot of ways. And what does it mean to be, and am I still an activist if I left? Can I still consider myself an activist? And I think this is very complicated. I think that there's a lot of different factors, but absolutely, I think there's definitely more hybrid forms of identity that are emerging, and trying to even how you narrate your own personal trajectory, right? Which I think is very complicated in these conditions, because conflict-fueled diasporas, it's very complicated, and there's a lot of very mixed emotions as a result of that. Yeah.
Okay, I think there are no more questions.
Yeah.
And we're right on time.
Oh, great.
Thank you so much.
For too long.
No, but I think your presentation had so much information that I think it's just it's so well explained to me, honestly. Because I had some questions written down as you were talking, and then we reached the conclusion, like, okay.
Well, I'm glad, but this is also the strength. You know, this is a collaborative. There's 3 other authors, so I have to do credit to the co-authors, the authors of the empirical chapters. I do encourage people to read it if they're interested. And, you know, these are people who have worked extensively on this subject. So, you know, they've got other publications on the Iraqi, Libyan, and Yemeni diasporas as well. And, you know, visit the website as well if it's something you're interested in, because there's a lot of other resources out there as well.
I mean, this lecture is recorded and will be on the YouTube channel of UM. So if you like, we can also add the links to the research that you just shared, so people can have a look if they want to read further into it.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
And so thank you again, Dr. Sarah, for this really insightful lecture. I myself thoroughly enjoyed it. And I hope I hope the attendees also had a broader idea or a deeper idea of of identity formation among the Arab diaspora in Europe. And if you are interested in other lectures for the Euro-Arab conversations, there are still 2 happening. One on the 25th of April with Dr. Chloé Kattar, who is a historian on the modern Middle East, and one on the 17th of May with Dr. Amir Bisat, and it's more of an economical aspect, political economics between Euro-Arab relations. So you can check our website, social media to stay informed. And thank you again, Dr. Sarah, for your time. And yeah, thank you so much for everyone who joined.
Thank you. My pleasure. Have a nice evening, everyone.